Review copy provided by Nintendo. There's been a general uneasiness around Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. It started off as a Kickstarter project that rode the wave of being the spiritual successor to classic Castlevania games. Through developer changes, delays, and so on, it was safe to say that many gamers were wary of just how Bloodstained would turn out. That's why I'm happy and relieved to say that despite it not having the AAA funding or the name of a new Castlevania game, this is still very much a new Castlevania game. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night puts you in the shoes of Miriam, a shard binder who's able to absorb the power of demons. She's one of many, or at least there used to be many. Upon waking up from a decade-long slumber, Miriam realizes that all but her and her fellow shardbinder, Jibble, have been slain. Unlike her though, Jibble has fallen under the demonic powers from the crystals in his skin, leading him to go completely insane and ultimately release hell. Story elements are introduced through cutscenes and conversations between characters every few hours. It's apparent that storytelling isn't Bloodstained's strongest suit, and it tries to bring up a lot of lore right away. It isn't the easiest thing to follow, and I can expect some players to get lost in what actually is going on as you travel throughout the campaign. Luckily, that isn't the star of this game, and that instead comes down to the gameplay. This is truly Bloodstained's bread and butter. The Metroidvania genre has gotten increasingly more popular since it first caught the eye of many gamers with Castlevania. Both AAA and indie games alike have used it and morphed the genre into completely new experiences. Koji Igarashi's Metroidvania, though, is the classic form of the genre and is at the center stage here in Bloodstained. Miriam is an incredibly customizable character both in terms of looks and gameplay style. This all comes back to the heavy RPG integration. You're able to mess around with items, clothing, even down to hairstyles and voice. The shards that you collect in the world affect Miriam differently depending on the crystal, also helping to shape combat. If you're a defensive player, you can have crystals that offer better defense support at the cost of stronger attacks. Perhaps you don't like to get up and close with enemies, so you might invest in a long-range attack stat booster instead. However, the more Miriam invests into these crystals, the more susceptible she becomes to the demonic forces, and so that's one thing to take note of. In the end, my playstyle and your playstyle might vary, but that opens up the campaign to feel differently for each player, regardless of all of us going on the same adventure. It doesn't stop there though. Looting treasure chests throughout the world leads to finding items, pieces of equipment, or even weapons to use in fights. There's a couple of shops and crafting areas too where you can either purchase or forge new items based on what you've collected. All of the equipable items have stats attached to them, and it'll be up to you to decide which is worth using. For example, I gravitated towards the heavy but also higher in attack weapons. These are slow, requiring more time and momentum to swing, but usually landing more damage per hit. The smaller dagger on the other hand is weaker, but is also able to strike faster in a smaller attack range. Outside of the main campaign, you'll also come across a few side quests like going to slay a specific amount of monsters in an area. They're alright distractions, but I mostly gravitated towards the campaign. Ultimately, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night felt like a lovely mix of classic Castlevania with some modernization game design like the fast travel, slightly more forgiving combat, and so on. It doesn't feel like an evolution to the gameplay of older Metroidvania games, but instead feels like it pays homage to them. In conjunction with the fleshed out RPG system that let me create my own playstyle by upgrading the aspects I liked, I had a great time journeying through hell. Bloodstained looks good, and I'm happy to say that because I think a lot of people were worried when the word got out that it was going through a whole visual overhaul. I wasn't blown away by the graphics, but it features some solid presentation that has this very gothic theme over everything. The final product mixes a lot of contrasting designs that somehow just work well. The 2D gameplay is done in a 3D environment in combination with multiple layers and a new lighting system. That lighting system shines, and no pun intended. The visual design style here is great, also contrasting the look of realistic environmental textures and anime-looking character models. It sort of reminds me a lot of the anime-based RPGs like the SAO series that use more realistic textures that then contrast the anime models. In Bloodstained, I found that it helps you keep track of both your character and the enemies around you. I think the only time the visuals ran into a major hiccup were in the occasional pop-in moment, or when the camera pulled away back and made it hard to platform the 3D environment in 2D. In terms of performance, you can see a 1080p 60 performance on the base PS4 and Xbox One, with it being bumped up to 1440p and native 4K on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. On the Nintendo Switch, you'll see framerate get locked to 30 frames per second while running at 720p in handheld mode and a dynamic 720p in dock mode. It's a bummer to see the framerates halved on Switch, but in actual use it felt fine. Even the lower resolution in handheld mode was good thanks to the smaller display. The problem with the Switch version would instead be the massive crankdown of compositing effects. The Switch version looks darker and generally has a lot of effects missing. I think it's most apparent in the introduction where about 80% of the rain effects are completely missing. Frame rates across all platforms can also get a bit finicky when there's a lot of enemies on screen. These moments were brief though and didn't ruin the gameplay for me. I think if you want to play this on the go, you'll be fine with the less pretty Switch version, but if the higher frame rate is a priority for you, then you should definitely bump up to one of the other platforms. This soundtrack slaps hard. The fast-paced Lu Voyage of Promise is catchy, and it makes me wish it was a song in Super Smash Bros. On the opposite end is the song Surpassing Grief that brings the tempo down for a more emotional piece that sounds like it was ripped out of Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. The range of emotions the soundtrack is able to compel out of me is extraordinary, and it speaks to the degree of how well it was made. Across the campaign's emotional highs and lows, you can count on the music to be the cherry on top every time. Michiro Yamane's work DNA can be found in just about every one of these tracks, and it's marvelous. The voice acting, on the other hand, I thought was just decent. It wasn't bad, but it didn't really stand out to me much, but I think that's more because the actors didn't have a lot to work with and not the other way around. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night doesn't reinvent the wheel, but instead feels like a return to form to classic Castlevania. It offers a robust RPG system that truly allows you to make Miriam feel like your own unique character. The presentation admittedly isn't jaw-dropping for me, but works here with an interesting mix of 2D and 3D with lovely lighting design. You'll have to deal with the occasional frame rate and platforming hiccup, but that shouldn't stray you away, especially if you've been eager for more Symphony of the Night.